Hello, everyone. My name is Angela Dow, Meetings and Events Manager for HFTP. Welcome to today's webinar, Cybersecurity. Data breaches, cybersecurity issues dominate today's headlines. In the world that is becoming more interconnected via the Internet of Things, cyber issues is no longer being ignored by small businesses, especially in the hospitality sector. In the webinar today, we will discuss cyber issues facing managements and broads, and 3 things that you can do now to start to protect your business from cyber attacks. Our presenter today is Mr. Harvey Johnson. He has over 15 years of public accounting experience. Mr. Johnson is a partner in charge of the firm's Hospitality Roads region. In addition, he serves as the firm's team leader for the Cyber and Control Risk Services Group. As such, oversees the supervised and performs of applications of the information technology cyber's relating engagement. Mr. Johnson is the author of numerous articles in cybersecurity, has been a frequent guest speaker in the industry conference and seminars on cybersecurity issues. Please help me welcome your presenter today, Harvey Johnson. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Good morning, Angela. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for joining us today. Just before we get started, I want to say that in doing my presentations around the country, I certainly like for the conversation, for it to be more like a conversation versus me just presenting and talking to you all. And I know that's a little bit more of a challenge electronically over the webinar. It's a little easier to be obviously engaging and interactive when we're all in the same room together, but certainly hope that you will ask questions throughout. Please don't hold them to the end. As Robin mentioned, we do have a Q&A panel, which we will be monitoring, monitoring and fielding those questions as they come up. A little bit about our presentation for today. We're just going to talk about cybersecurity, why it's important, some of the things that we are seeing in the cyberspace today, as well as some of the threats to the hospitality sector, include 2 of the biggest areas of risk I see right now across the landscape, across any business really, not just limited to the hospitality sector, but 2 areas of really important focus right now. We're going to talk about third-party risk as well as cyber insurance. Since we are not together and you can't see me, I thought it would be nice to just show you a little bit about Harvey Johnson. This is kind of my life in a nutshell, if you will. I am happily married to my wife, Sarah, and we have 3 beautiful daughters, Stella, Madeline, and Lucy, who we live at the Virginia Beach area, so we are surrounded by water, spend a lot of time at the water. I myself am an avid surfer and have convinced my littlest to join me in the water. So you can see a picture of her out there on the board with me. She's been surfing on the end of my surfboard since she was about 2 years old. So that's been a lot of fun and a lot of enjoyment, certainly, in our life. A little bit about PV Mayers, in case you're unfamiliar with our firm. We are the largest full-service Virginia-based accounting and consulting firm in Virginia. We are ranked in the top 100 accounting firms inside public accounting. And we have about 45 partners with more than 270 professionals, and that's across 10 offices now, 8 in the Virginia, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, as well as 2 offices now, in Maryland. Our firm does obviously more than just traditional audit and tax compliance services. One of the areas that we have really started to transition into is this area of cybersecurity. And this isn't really anything new for us. Cyber is just kind of the new buzzword that we put around IT and information security. So I tend to use InfoSec and information security a little bit interchangeably with cybersecurity, even though cyber does encompass a few more components. But we've been doing this for a while, previous to quote unquote our cyber niche. We had an IT department, and that group performed cyber risk assessments, vulnerability scannings, both internal and external of your network, penetration testing, as well as IT general control audits, service organization control audits. If you are outsourcing one of your key processes to a third party, i.e. an ADP or someone else for your accounting back office solutions, whatever the case is, you want to gain assurance that that vendor has controls over their software or their process, whatever service they're providing to you. So these are third-party reports that are provided. They're highly technical in nature, and that's just part of the service offerings that our firm provides, as well as a host of consulting services related to developing a cyber risk management program. So we'll talk a little bit about why cyber security is important. Today, you'll see that just essentially everything is connected to the internet, from our computers, our phones, our iPads, our Fitbits, just anything that is technical in nature or that is connecting to the internet. One of the things that is becoming an issue and a lot talked about is critical infrastructure, your buildings, your third-party monitoring systems of your buildings can create an attack vector. The target breach is a really good example, and we'll dive into that a little bit later on, of how an HVAC, a vendor that is monitoring your information systems, can cause a cyber breach. So very, very important to talk about the data at risk. These slides may be a little bit to see, but you can see here the main cause of data breaches continue to be employees as well as third parties, contractors. So significant amount of data breaches happening in the world and continuing to evolve at a rapid pace. No longer is it just the Fortune 500 or the government or your big banks or hospitals that are susceptible to breaches. We're really seeing this shift a shift away from a lot of the larger businesses to small businesses. The internet is increasing the ability to hackers to go at a broader base and a smaller base of targets, and in particular, a lot of times small and medium-sized businesses are easier targets. If you think about it, your larger organizations, your Fortune 500 companies, they have a lot of money to spend on IT and cybersecurity, probably a lot more than you do. So from a hacker's perspective, if you think about it, it's a lot easier or why would I try to break into Fort Knox when you can go across the street and walk into someone's back door because they left it wide open? So obviously the payoff there isn't quite the same, but as far as time and effort and probability of getting caught from a hacker's perspective, you're much better off going after smaller businesses, because the FBI and the government aren't necessarily going to be coming after you or after those criminals. They're going to be focused on the people who are breaching the Equifaxes, the Targets, those types of companies. So a little bit of food for thought as we really see this shift in landscape from attacks from larger entities and larger companies to smaller businesses. As we talk some more about some of the cyber stats, these just continue to amaze me as they get published and updated each year. So first thing to maybe note is that in 2017 there was 1.9 billion personal and other sensitive data records exposed. That's actually quite the drop from 2016 when we had a record 4.8 billion. A little bit of some unique items happening there in 2016. You had the Yahoo breach, which was over 500 million customers. You had Target, which was another couple hundred million customers. I mean, those two alone represented a significant number of those breaches that occurred during that year. And as we look to the average cost of a data breach, that's $3.62 million. I don't care if you've got insurance or not, that's still a lot of money and an awful lot of headache and hassle that really come with dealing with a breach. A lot of folks aren't necessarily or aren't as so much worried about the financial loss because they feel like they do have a good insurance policy. They care a lot about the reputational loss, and particularly as you look at the hospitality sector, you want to make sure that you're taking care of your members' data, especially if you have a high-profile client base or certainly regardless of your client base. You're going to want to make sure you're protecting their information that can only have a negative impact as you think about the reputation of your club. So $141 per record. So for every piece of data that it's lost, that's $140 out of the organization's expense. So in a recent survey of over 1,200 companies, over 77% said they did not have an IRP. And an IRP stands for an Incident Response Plan. This is the plan that we're going to implement specifically when we have and discover a data breach. It's different than a business continuity plan. It's different from a disaster recovery plan. Those are components and those are elements that we would think about as we consider an incident response plan. But the incident response plan is really going to address those issues that arise as a result of the breach. We're going to have to notify the police, so notify law enforcement. We're going to have to notify our members at some point. So how do we notify or the affected parties? How do we notify them? What's the method of communication? What's the message? Especially when you don't know or may not know the extent of the breach. As you see here on the last statistic on this slide, it's 191 days, over half a year before a breach is typically discovered. And then the second you discover it, your first notion, typically while you want to communicate it to those affected, isn't to rush to tell them, because we don't know how bad it is. And if you don't know the extent of the breach and you don't know how bad it is, you probably want to be cautious about going and notifying those affected too quickly. So that becomes a delicate timing consideration, because you don't want to wait too long either. The longer it goes from the date of discovery, the date you become aware of a breach, from the time you notify those affected parties, that timing is significant, and it's going to have an impact on their perception of how you handle that breach, whether it was important to you, their data and whatnot. So lots of things to consider there. You would probably want to provide third-party monitoring services for those who are affected by a breach. Who's going to provide it? What type of coverage? For how long? Those types of things are all part of our incident response plan. Also, that we need to consider as part of that IRP is our insurance, and making sure, A, that we have a good insurance plan in place, and making sure that we're meeting any triggers. Same principle as I mentioned earlier about the notification. A lot of insurance policies will have a 45-day window that you need to notify your insurance company within 45 days of discovering a breach. Going past that time frame could limit the company's ability to get some of those proceeds or get some of that coverage. You don't want to put yourself in a position where coverage could be denied or limited because you weren't following the rules. And particularly with cyber insurance, that's really, really important to consider. Some more interesting cyber stats as we talk about the various devices and things that become and are connected to the Internet of Things. I thought it was really interesting that 100%, and this is the same survey of over 1,200 companies, 100% of the respondents had a mobile device attack of organizations that have over 500 devices connected to their network. My point there being the more items connected to your network, the more attack vectors that creates. Every time there's an iPad, an iPhone, a fax machine, a wireless guest network, whatever the case is, anytime something is connecting to your network, it is establishing and creating a potential attack vector. So think about it that way. The more devices we have on our network, the more opportunities we have for an attack. So interesting perspective there. Another area not getting a lot of attention right now is device management, and in particularly when it comes to mobile devices. We may be sending out patches and updating workstations and laptops, but so often we forget about those mobile devices that are connected. Also, of those surveyed, 54% reported a security incident with their industrial control system. This is kind of what I was back to mentioning earlier. This critical infrastructure is becoming a really, really important issue nationally as we talk about national security and our critical infrastructure. But from a business level perspective, that's also very important because, as we'll talk about later with Target, even low-risk vendors and even systems that you wouldn't necessarily think could be a potential risk to your organization can cause a huge impact. And then over half the respondents allow third-party suppliers, vendors, etc. to access their data. And we will talk about that. So we are reaching our first poll question for today.
Okay, so if you do not have it on your screen already, momentarily, you should see the first poll question for today. It says, do you feel you are informed or very informed about cyber risks facing the club? It is a simple yes or no question, and I'm just going to give everyone a few moments to send in their answers, and I will read the results in just a minute. Okay, and as the results are coming in and starting to slow down, Harvey, it looks like about 60% of our audience has answered yes and 40% has answered no.
Oh, interesting. Great, and thank you for your help with that. And that's, I think, generally consistent with what I would expect to see. The National Club Association did a very interesting piece last summer in their quarterly magazine. There was a whole section on cybersecurity and cyber in specifically the private club sector and a lot of the issues affecting them, private clubs. And I was astonished that 78% of the respondents said yes, that they were very informed about cyber risk affecting their club. And I was a little suspicious and definitely had realized that The people responding to that survey were not any of the clubs that I had been to in the last couple of years. Just in regards to, that's really not the case of what we're seeing in the market, and not what I would expect to see. I mean, part of the issue here with cybersecurity and why it's a struggle for so many people is it's just outside of their wheelhouse. This is not comfortable. If you're talking to me about how to manage my club and the restaurant or the hotel greens or the maintenance, the operation, those things, like, I'm comfortable with that. I understand it. I know the types of risk there. I'm comfortable managing that risk because of my experience and because it's so just in part of the industry. Cybersecurity isn't that way. It's new. It's different. It's got technology as part of it, so it's inherently different than for what most people's background is. Most people know how to work a computer, but as far as coding and vulnerabilities and networking and segmentation and types of attacks and how to protect your network, well, that's just stuff that we're not comfortable with. And so then you're relying on other people, third parties, to help mitigate and manage that risk. And so really when we're talking about cybersecurity and we're really spreading the message about why it's important, I've always shared that the education has really been a two-part process. Part one, and phase one, was getting small businesses to realize that they were a target. A couple of years ago, that was a completely different situation. Most clubs felt like, no, I'm not a target. I'm not worried about it. I would often hear, well, we don't store credit cards. It's only through a third-party website. That doesn't matter. I've heard we don't store personal information on our members on any of our systems or information. I find that to be highly unusual and incorrect most of the time. So there was this moment in education of recognizing that we are a possible attack and a possible victim. Then I think with the ransomware and the other types of malware that have really been popular in the last year or so have gotten people's attention. Certainly the number of data breaches, you can't open your web browser and look at Yahoo News without finding or reading an article about the latest breach or type of attack. So we've gotten past phase one. Really, phase two is understanding what are the types of ways to help manage that risk. What is network segmentation? What's the difference between a pen test and a vulnerability assessment? A lot of folks get that confused. So being informed about cyber risk is not necessarily something and a response I would expect to hear. Let's move on to our next poll question.
Okay, and the next poll question should appear on your screen in just a moment. Do you train employees on cybersecurity issues on an annual basis? Again, a simple yes or no question, and I'm going to give everyone a few moments to answer that. I will read the results in just a minute. All right, and as the results are coming in and starting to slow down, it looks like we actually have an even split of 50-50 yes and no.
Excellent, thank you. And that is interesting enough, exactly what the respondents said in the national survey of the private clubs. So 49% of the respondents said yes, and 50% of the respondents said they trained their boards on cyber security. So really, really important if there is of the things that you may not be doing. Training your employees and implementing a training program security awareness is one of the most important and simple things you can do. At the end of the day, businesses are built off of people, processes, and technology, and people being the integral point there, and particularly when we talk about cyber attacks, the most common sources of a data breach are a negligent employee or a third-party contractor. Again, people. The most type of attack and common source of attack is phishing scams. Again, dealing with people. Over 90% of all data breaches can be traced back to some human element. So the importance of training them, and not just training them on an annual basis, but finding a way to integrate and get an ongoing training program so that we're constantly informing, educating, and reminding our employees about the importance of being vigilant when it comes to cybersecurity. That old adage of think before you click, hover over the email before you click, all of those things really important and not addressed nearly enough. This is also one of those areas that when it comes down to dollars and cents and bang for your buck, this is great value and return on investment. Getting and doing the annual training, as well as getting and implementing a training program, is at most a couple $1,000. It's maybe $2,000 at most. This is not a lot of effort. It's not a lot of money, and it's something that you can implement and do on an ongoing basis once you get the right tools set up. So very, very important to be continuing to train our employees. So let's talk about what are the top issues and the top threats to club security. Well, first and foremost, it's things that we've already touched on a little bit today. The lack of awareness and understanding of cyber risk at the senior levels, whether it's the general manager, the CEO, CFO, the board, the owners, whoever the decision makers are in the organization, 9 times out of 10 don't have a sound enough understanding of cyber risk to make good educated decisions on the types of investments to make and prioritizing those investments. And it's also even a greater challenge of when you don't understand the cyber risk. This goes back to that point I made earlier. When you don't understand cyber and cyber risk, you're going to be more hesitant to spend money on protecting the organization from a cyber attack, because we don't know which tools to implement. We don't know, or we don't feel confident of which tools to implement. Which one is the right one? How do I know that I've spent enough money? When is enough? How do we know? Is it the fact that we didn't get breached today? Is that why I sleep better tonight? What is my return on investment from cybersecurity? So understanding your cybersecurity risk is really, really important. One of the things that we find most often, one of the things that we say in regards to starting to address your cybersecurity risk is starting to understand the data and information in your environment. Where does it live? What is our sensitive data? Member data, employee data. What systems does it live on, and where is it within our organization? Does it arrive on systems that we host? Is it web-based systems? Are they cloud-based? Where does that data live? Another issue that we find as a top threat is this lack of an incident response plan. Most small businesses go out of business within 6 months of a data breach. That is because they don't have a good incident response plan. That includes proper insurance, but is that component that I talked about earlier, that mentioning of communications with law enforcement, communications with affected third parties, communications with the media, the breach notification, third-party monitoring, all of those, the insurance, all of those pieces that are just some of the components of an incident response plan are important to an entity surviving a data breach. And then the last issue is third-party risk. This managing third-party risk is becoming a really, really big issue, particularly as we're outsourcing more and more functions and we're relying on more and more third parties to help provide our services or support our environment. I would bet that many of you don't have a fully dedicated IT staff on site and are supplementing or outsourcing fully your IT help functions to a third party. That's fine. That's a great way to manage costs and to manage employee counts. But does that vendor have carte blanche access to the network? Do we control when they do and don't have that access to the network? Because that's going to be relevant. So when we talk about cyber risk, it really does encompass a wide variety of things from an organization. This is your network security. This is our firewalls, our wireless configurations, how we've segmented the network. How do we manage and apply our updates to systems, particularly our laptops and third-party devices? You know, you want consistency so that every machine, every computer has the same set of security standards based on it. So you will have a baseline. You want to manage those updates and that. So a lot of items coming into that. We're talking about our third-party monitoring and vendor oversight, your incident response, your removable media. I mean, cyber risk management really, really encompasses a lot of different areas. And so it's hard to maybe get your arms around all of them, but they're very, very important. And as we talked about this third-party risk, it's a good opportunity to highlight our friend Target. I mean, here is a perfect example of third-party risk and how that is important to just understand where your data is. So in the Target example, they had a situation where they had a third-party vendor manage their HVAC systems. So as part of that, you want to monitor the systems. They have software and things in place so that monitor the health. Is it operating as it intended? Is the temperature correctly? Are there places that are shut down, or there are parts that are broken? So they constantly are monitoring the health of those environmental control systems. And again, that creates an attack vector. So in the Target situation, their vendor happened to already have been compromised, and the attackers had been kind of advanced on their network for some time. They were monitoring what was happening, and once they had connected, the vendor connected into Target to establish that connection and check on the health system of the HVAC, now the attackers had access to the Target network. And they were able to leverage that access to once they got onto the network, and because their network wasn't segmented, the same network that the HVAC system was on was the same network that the point of sale system was on. And so once the attackers got on the network, it was just a matter of time before they got access to that sensitive credit card data. So that highlights two important risks for us. One, the third-party risk. This is what we talk about supply chain. Even if our controls are in place, and even if we have a good control environment, we're only as strong as our weakest link in the chain. What are our vendors doing? Do they have good controls in place, and are they monitoring their systems and their cybersecurity? So that in the Target case, because they had that weak link in the supply chain, they had a breach of their environment. What's also important is this concept of network segmentation and the importance of having those separated. And this is a very, again, a very simple concept, and one that's not costly, assuming you've taken the time to do it right from the beginning. Now, I'll give Target a little bit of a break here in that, boy, given the time these networks were set up and established, this just wasn't necessarily a bigger risk. And even if I were managing my third-party risk and looking at my critical vendors, boy, my HVAC vendor would be pretty low on my critical vendor list. The only reason that they're relevant is because of the data that they had access to on the network. So if you think about your home network or your office, you probably have two wireless networks. You have a wireless network for your home or your work, your employees, and then you have like the guest wireless network, right? This is the importance and the concept of network segmentation. On the guest wireless network, rights are limited. Maybe we'll let you get access to the internet, but you can't. It's not connected to our network. So if something goes wrong over here, it's just isolated to this environment, versus our home or our office network where everyone else is. And so if those networks are segmented, if something is a problem with the guest or the vendor network, then it's isolated to that. It's very, very difficult. It can be done, but it's much more technically difficult to leap over onto another wireless network like that and continue your attack. So a very, very important concept of network segmentation. Also a very important concept of managing and controlling this vendor access. If you want to think about it like a door, you want to open and close that door, and you want to be in control of it. So if you have a third-party vendor, let's stick with our IT vendor. We're outsourcing that, and they have to connect to our network to either troubleshoot things, install updates for us. But you know what? I don't want them doing that and accessing our network 24/7. I want to be able to control that access so that it's like a switch, or you open the door and you say, now we're going to let you in when we need you, not just leaving the door wide open. Similarly, you would want to understand from that vendor is who from their employees have access to your network. You know, there's pros and cons of having a generic ABC company's access versus having Joe from ABC company and John Smith from ABC company. The pros are, well, we only have one account to manage. We only have one door to open. The negative is, you know, if there's turnover at your vendor and their employees leave, well, you would hope that they would remove their access from all of your systems as well. And so it becomes more difficult to manage that user provisioning when you only have generic accounts. Best practice is anyone who's having and logging into your network has their own separate account. So vendor management is in itself an entire separate webinar that we could do. We could, been using the wrong doors here, or the wrong slides. Vendor management is an entirely separate webinar that we could do just on managing third-party risk. But if you're wanting more information about this, the OCC actually has some of the best resources that are absolutely free when it comes to vendor management. So if you are researching or Googling vendor management and OCC, You will find some really, really good guidance in regards to policies, programs, what are some of the key vendor risks to be on the lookout for, and some of the key considerations. It's guidance, it's built for banks, and it's a little, you'll constantly have them use the term financial institution, but rest assured, it's really just sound business advice, and it applies to your organization as well. So substitute club for financial institution in there, and you're going to have a very, very good sound vendor management program and addressing some of these key risks. So some of the key takeaways from there are understanding your third-party contracts, identifying and ranking those based off of criticality, who has access to your network, and who has access, more importantly, to your sensitive information. Those become more critical. Requiring SOC reports for these third-party vendors, obtaining and reviewing those as well, and some other really good controls there. So let's talk real briefly about cyber insurance. I know we're running a little short on time here. So cyber insurance is the easy answer, right? I'm not going to worry about my cyber risk because I'm just going to get insurance, and that's going to be enough because I don't understand it, I don't know what to do, and so I'm giving up. I'm going to get insurance. And I'm not saying not to get insurance. That is very, very important. But you can't just get insurance, and you don't want to just get insurance in isolation, because one of the things that we're seeing, and you tend to see anytime there is insurance companies and businesses debating claims and the right to money, insurance companies are going to look for ways to manage their exposure and reduce their exposure. So you've got to be on your P's and Q's and making sure you are kind of doing the basic minimum, the basic IT hygiene, if you will, for having minimum controls and procedures at your place. You can't just rely on insurance, because even if you have insurance, the question is, do you have the right type of cyber insurance? So one of the common myths is, I'm already covered. And that may or may not be true. I mean, general liability, E&O, and other types of insurance may have some component or some element of cyber coverage, but it's probably limited in what it will cover, and it's probably not enough. More and more, you are finding specific cyber insurance policies. And there's different types of cyber insurance. I mean, it can be put into three broad buckets, but there are hybrids and different components of each and every one of these. Your first party coverage covers the breached party. This is what happens to who is the affected party. This covers all of the expenses of the breach, discovering what happened, containing what happened, the incident response procedures, all of that stuff, the data discovery and recovery, all of that, the business interruption expenses gets covered in your first party expenses. Third party kind of covers your expenses on the back end. This is what's happened after the breach. You lost my data, I'm upset about it, I'm going to sue you. So that typically covers the lawsuit aspect of customer liability, wrongful disclosure of health, PII, or otherwise confidential information. And then you could also get some coverage regarding regulatory assessments and fines. And this is important, and I'll share this, what was a horror story for a while for this institution, but I was at a client a couple of years ago, and cyber insurance was still pretty new, and they had asked me to look over their cyber insurance policy. And one of the things as we were looking over it, they had $10 million in cyber liability. So this is the who's going to sue us after the fact, right? $10 million, especially for this size of the organization, wasn't bad. It was adequate for their needs. What wasn't adequate was their cyber breach expense. And that was limited to a $500,000 max out of pocket. Well, this organization had over 50,000 members, and not just locally, but worldwide. And so the cost of dealing with an actual breach, the discovery, the data forensics, and hiring accountants and other cybersecurity experts to figure out what happened, you're talking thousands of dollars. The notification to the 50,000 members who would be affected, the credit monitoring and ongoing monitoring for 50,000 people, all of that would have gone through and blown so fast through their cyber maximum on the expense side that their policy was out of whack. So when we talk about most businesses go out of business within 6 months of a data breach, here's a perfect example of why. This client would have been another victim in a breach because their cyber insurance wasn't adequate to cover all of the issues and everything that they had. Even if you have good coverage, that doesn't mean that it won't get denied. We're dealing with the first public case that I've seen where a company is suing its insurance carrier for failing to cover a cyber policy. Now, some really unique facts related to this case, but two important facts. One, the company was hacked twice in a year, and it was a bank, and so they had ATMs, so it hit their ATM machines twice over 2 separate years, and the insurance company is arguing two things. One, that they're arguing there were not 2 breaches, there was only 1. So a lot of times your coverage will be limited to per incident. So they're limiting the incident to 1 instead of 2, which limits the coverage. And 2, they're saying that the type of cyber or attack that it was isn't covered under the cyber policy that they were filing it under. So again, that uniqueness of the type of cyber breach expense coverage they have and what they were claiming, the insurance company isn't buying it. And so this is actually really recent. This was the case was just brought up in August. So still developing, very, very interested to see where this goes. But moral of the story is you can't rely on insurance alone here or be negligent and think that that's enough. You obviously don't want to be this person who is building their house on sand on the beach, right? You want to be the person who's maybe building their house a little further back off the shore, not so close to the water, and providing a little bit more protection. So very, very important to consider. If the organization has weak IT controls, claims could be limited or denied. So you want to pay close attention to those sections on your exclusions, your exemptions, limitations, and infidelity, and just, indemnity, and make sure that you understand each and every one of those provisions and review those with an attorney. So if you're thinking about buying cyber insurance, here are the top 5 things that I would consider. 1, you need to understand your unique risk. The more information you share with your broker about your business, your profile, what you do, the types of IT things that you're already doing in place, the better. That will help them develop the right coverage for you. I also strongly encourage that you deal with someone who has experience with cyber insurance. That shouldn't be hard to do now. There are enough companies doing it. But B, consider reviewing it with either a data privacy attorney or someone like PB Mayers that understands your cyber policies and can help you assess, do I have enough coverage? Beware of the exclusions and certainly the triggers. You know, are there limitations? Is there an expectation for us to maintain a minimum IT controls? A lot of times there is. Is there triggers that say we have to notify the insurance company within X number of days? I guarantee you there is. You want to understand that so that you are notifying them promptly in the event you have a situation. Go retro. You want to get retroactive coverage. Most policies will go back 6 months to a year and cover you from that time just before you've gotten your cyber insurance policy. Even if it's a new policy, you've had cyber insurance before, but it's a new policy. Maybe you heard Harvey's webinar today and you're like, oh man, I don't have my right coverage, and so you go out and get a new policy that is got different coverage elements or expanded coverage. You can still go back and get this retroactive coverage for that time period so that if there were breaches that occurred before your policy was in place, you'd still be covered. Remember the stat I gave you before. It's over 6 months before most companies discover a breach anyway. So you already may be compromised and may not know it. Very, very important to go retro on your coverage. Cover acts and omissions by third parties. This should address and make sure, again, you understand what third parties are accessing your network and your systems, as well as getting coverage to protect you in the event that someone in the supply chain, a vendor, a third party, causes the data breach. And then cover loss of information of unencrypted devices, as well as data restoration. That just makes sure you cover the expensive stuff. That data restoration cost can be very, very expensive, especially if you don't have good data backup and disaster recovery plans. So real quickly, I know we are really winding down and getting really close on time here. So I wanted to leave you with my top couple of cybersecurity controls. These are the things that you can start doing today to better protect and understand your organization from cyber risk. Number one, understanding your data and environment. That means performing a risk assessment. A risk assessment will help you identify the data, and most of you probably know it in your head what data you have. But I guarantee you, once you go through the process of starting to identify the different systems it lives on, you'll find, one, you've got a lot of data in a lot of different places, and two, you'll be surprised as to when you think about it, oh, this data is important too. Well, maybe we should be protecting this data. So the only way and the best way to understand that is performing a risk assessment to identify what critical data we have and where does it live in our digital ecosystem. Remember the target breach. Had they segmented their network, had they understood their data and knew that their critical credit card data should be segmented on a separate network from their ancillary HVAC system, that would have saved them a lot of reputation and a couple, $100 million in expenses. So number two, establishing a formal information security or cybersecurity program. Guys, remember that wheel, that kind of black slide of all the different areas? There's probably 9 different domains of cybersecurity when you talk about policy and governance and third-party risk and device management and patch management, configuration management, disaster recovery, business continuity, incident response. all of these are elements of this cyber risk management plan that is just overwhelming. So how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And it's starting to get your arms around those different areas within your organization that are important to understanding and your cybersecurity risk. Number 3 is making sure you've got good disaster recovery and backup procedures. Again, the cost of a breach can be very, very expensive. Cost of data restoration can be very expensive. It's not just good enough to back it up data. Unless you've tested that backup and you know it works, you haven't backed up your data because you don't know. And so very, very important to have a good program around that. I prefer redundancy over backup, a little more costly, but the more and more you can implement redundant systems, less and less backup becomes a factor. Understanding your third-party contract and service level agreements, I talked pretty much ad nauseum about that earlier, as well as establishing an incident response plan. Again, most companies go out of business within 6 months because they don't have an incident response plan. It's important for you to get that plan, walk through those exercises, and understand what type of procedures we need to implement in the event we discover a breach. And good timing, because that is all I had today, as well as all the time we had for today. So I will take a moment and ask if there are any questions as we are wrapping up against our timeline. Okay, well, one question in, and it's what's the difference between a risk assessment, a vulnerability assessment, and a penetration test? Really good question. I get this a lot, and I'll kind of start in maybe a reverse order. So if you think about these, the level of time and expense, your vulnerability scan is the least expensive and also gives you the least assurance, but really important to do as part of your cyber program. This is where you would scan all of the devices and things that are connected to your network, looking for vulnerabilities. It's technical in nature, and it's going to focus on those technical vulnerabilities. It's something that you as an organization can be doing yourself. It's very, very cheap. There's common commercial software out there that will scan your network for you, and you could do it every day if you wanted to. Once a year, once a month, once a quarter, whatever the frequency, you can do that on your own. A penetration test is where someone is actually trying to come in and break into your network. I often will get folks asking for this instead of a risk assessment. I say you should do a risk assessment first, because it's important to understand your data and how you've protected your data, or else the pen test doesn't mean anything. One, because chances are if you haven't done a risk assessment and haven't put any controls in place to begin with, well, you shouldn't be surprised when someone breaks into your environment. Your goal there isn't to learn how to break into the environment yet. You already know you're susceptible. What you need to do first is learn your environment, set up a perimeter, and then try someone come and break into it. Then you can start to understand those nuances about, well, where do we need to buffer or strengthen up our cybersecurity? A pen test is, yes, it will tell you where you're vulnerable, but it's also going to be super focused. It's going to be very, very limited to that, and it's going to ignore some of those bigger picture issues like insurance and third-party risk that a pen test just isn't going to address and isn't going to cover. So I'm not saying don't do pen tests. I just think that's a step in the process, like a vulnerability scan. Risk assessment first, vulnerability scanning, then penetration tests in order of preference, if you will. So we have another question, what is the OCC you mentioned as source documents? Okay, so the OCC is the Office of Comptroller of the Currency. If you think about our banking entities, they're regulated by various bodies, the Federal Reserve Bank, the OCC, the NCUA for credit unions. They regulate and tell banks what to do and how to protect their customer information. Why? Well, because the banking is one of the most critical industries for hacking and hackers as a target for hackers. And so there's lots of good information about how to manage third-party risk in general. Again, it's not banking focused, it's IT, it's business focused. You'll see them use the term financial institution a lot, but the concepts within it, the concepts of establishing this vendor management program, the risk you should be looking for, the method of establishing critical your critical high risk vendors versus a moderate versus a low risk vendor are all just good business practice sense. So you would want to implement that. The OCC there is a really great place for resource there to learn more about third-party risk management, understanding vendor risk. And I think that is all the time we have for today. So I am going to turn it back over to Angela and Robin, and want to thank everyone for your time today and for having me. I hope you have found this informative, and please don't hesitate to reach out and contact me if you have any questions or want to learn more about cyber risk.
Okay. That is all the time that we have for today. On behalf of HFTP, thank you all for attending today's event, and thank you also to Harvey for a great presentation. This does conclude today's session. We hope that you have a great afternoon.